I'm your host, Aaron Heath. I'd like to take a moment to thank you for downloading, subscribing, and most importantly, listening to episode number 31 of the Gun Rights in Texas podcast. You can find the show notes by going to gunrightsintexas.com/031. Now, we're going to kick the show off with our gun of the show, but before we do that, let me tell you what we're going to talk about on this episode. This episode of the Gun Rights in Texas podcast, we're going to talk about reloading equipment. And then, in the next episode, we'll probably go back to doing things that are relating to gun rights on a more direct basis. However, if you want to shoot, you got to be able to have ammo. And if you want to shoot a lot, reloading is probably your best bet. Now then, we got that out of the way. Let's talk about our gun of the show for this episode, which is the Smith and Wesson Model 442 Second Amendment Foundation Commemorative Revolver. And I probably messed up that, but basically, the story behind the gun is, on June 26th of 2008, the Supreme Court of the United States of America issued a landmark ruling that would forever change the landscape for gun rights. The case that they issued a ruling on was the District of Columbia versus Heller. That decision established that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms, and that is important. Now, that case was brought to the Supreme Court by the Second Amendment Foundation, and to commemorate that, well, they created, in conjunction with Smith and Wesson, a laser-engraved Model 442 revolver in .38 Special to commemorate it. Now, if you're listening to the show on YouTube, you can switch over and you'll see that there is video of, or not video, but a picture in the video of this firearm. Now, the picture in the video is of my personal copy of that gun. It's a little dirty. It was recently at the range, I might say. However, after this episode, I'll give it a good cleaning and, well, it'll go back into the safe and maybe it'll be carried, maybe it won't, because all my guns are working guns. So let's talk about it. Now, like I said, this revolver was manufactured and it's nothing special. It's just laser engraved on the right side of the gun. Other than that, it's your typical Model 442. However, like I said, this particular version was released to commemorate the Heller decision. Now, you can go to the link in the show notes. You can see the pictures of the gun from Smith and Wesson. I don't know what gun they used for that because, well, that would be a much earlier production than mine. If I'm not mistaken, mine is actually one of the last ones made. That's based on when I bought it. However, I'm going to give you some specifications, and these specs really apply to any Model 442. And like I said, its model number is 442. And if you go to the show notes, you can click on a link and it'll take you to Smith & Wesson's page for this particular model of 442, this SAF Commemorative. Now, it's chambered in .38 Special. It's a 5-shot capacity. There's no +1 because it's a revolver. It's an autoloader has a +1, but revolvers do not. It is a double action only handgun. This is because the hammer is internal. There are versions of the J-frame that have a exposed hammer. There are versions that have I believe they call it a concealed hammer. The concealed hammer, you can actually still cock, but this one does not have those. It's the 442, which is an internal hammer model. Sights on this, well, they're fixed sights. The front sight is permanently affixed to the barrel. There is nothing you can do to adjust it. Well, a gunsmith can adjust it. And the way the gunsmith would adjust it is they would turn the barrel in the frame. The rear sight is really a channel cut into the top of the revolver. This is good for pocket carry or deep concealment because there's nothing really to snag. The design of these sights make it difficult for them to snag on anything. And the tactical guys will probably, well, you can't really cock that by using the sights to cock it. It's a revolver. You do not cock a revolver. I am sorry. This is not a cheap dime store novel. It's not a cheap Hollywood movie where every gun goes click, 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 click when it's empty. Although this one will. Listen, it's empty. Let me verify that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 empty chambers. I can see light all the way through them. I'm now going to point this thing at the floor, and I'm going to step out of the way of the microphone, and I'm going to press the trigger several times, just so you can hear what a revolver does when it fires on an empty cylinder. That is what you hear in Hollywood. And most semi-autos, unless they're an actual double action semi-auto, will not do that. There are a few that are, like SIGs, some SIGs, my FNX, H&Ks, Somebody, I know it's not Springfield Armory. Somebody, though, makes a 1911 with a double action trigger. God, talk about an abomination there. But that double action trigger on that 1911, I believe, will do it. Let's see here. I think that's about it. There are others. I think Smith and Wesson has a double action semi-auto. Taurus makes a few. However, you see in Hollywood movies, you see the Glock, and he'll press, the hero or the villain will press the trigger, go click, and he'll press it 4 or 5 more times, click, 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 click. Well, Glocks don't do that. Most 1911s do not do that. Most semi-autos do not do that. However, we're going to move on, and we're going to continue with, instead of my little rant about Hollywood and cheap novels and stories, we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about some more of the gun. Now, back to the specs. The frame on this thing is aluminum. The barrel and I believe and the cylinder are both carbon steel. The specs only say the cylinder. However, I'm relatively certain they did not make the barrel out of aluminum because that would be kind of stupid. And the grips, they're synthetic. Now, this particular revolver weighs 15 ounces. And in regards to the MSRP, well, good luck because it's no longer in production. You can find them used, you can find them unfired, but you won't find it at MSRP because they're no longer made. Now, with that said, I'm going to play the promo that tells you how to get the show. And like I mentioned earlier, this podcast is available on YouTube. I mean, you don't get to see me, thankfully. I wouldn't want to do that to your eyes. But anyways, the podcast is available on YouTube. That's not in this little audio clip. But you know what? We're going to play it anyway. The Gun Rights in Texas podcast is available on iTunes, on Stitcher, and in the Microsoft Windows podcast store. Of course, you can always download the show and see the show notes as well as comment by going to the website gunrightsintexas.com. Okay, we're going to move straight into our listener feedback. And Bill emailed me with a story about Kroger, and the story has a picture of a gentleman. And I say gentleman because it's an open carry advocate. It's not even the full open carry advocate. It's his hip and his leg that's in the picture. Well, the reason they took this picture is because this particular guy has 2 1911s of various sizes strapped onto his leg. One strapped to his leg with a drop holster and the other's attached to his hip. Now, he's literally carrying these guns with one above the other. And this is probably about as silly of a carry as you can get. Now, Bill asked, is there any real advantage to carrying in that manner? And the answer to that is no. The basic idea, I suspect, is the open carrier in the picture is operating under the idea that he is trying to make a statement. Unfortunately, his statement is kind of lost in the humor of the situation. And the reason I say that is, as soon as I saw the picture, I could not even read the article. I started laughing. And some people may say, well, why are you laughing at the open carrier? He's out there, he's marching for your rights. He's fighting for your rights. Actually, he's not. He's out there, he's trying to make a statement, and he's being silly in the process. You want to know how silly he is? This brings to mind a video by a gentleman by the name of Miklik. Okay? Those of you who do not know who that last name refers to need to go type in Miklik into a search engine. Type it in with the word gun. Anyways, there's a video, and Mr. Miklik kind of comes out. He's open carrying several firearms, talking about going to the store to get a gallon of milk. And guess what? He's making fun of the people that are open carrying multiple firearms, trying to show off. And that's kind of what's going on here in this picture. Carrying one firearm is perfectly fine. It doesn't really stand out. Carrying 2 firearms, if one's on each side, is a little more of a tactical decision because what if you're injured and your right hand cannot draw the firearm on the right hand? Well, your weak hand can draw the other one. Or, I say right hand, then weak hand. Let me say your strong hand may not be able to draw the firearm on its side. However, the weak hand may be able to draw the firearm on its side. It's still kind of a tactical thing. And when I say tactical, I don't mean tactical. I mean tactical. You're trying to be cool by pretending to do something that's tactical, kind of like a drop leg holster, which the gentleman in the picture had. But basically, carrying two handguns in that manner is nothing but an effort to put on a show. And the open carrier that was doing it, he's probably getting a laugh out of his picture being spread across the internet like it is. He probably thinks he did something cool. The media is using it to kind of, hey, look at these stupid people. They're carrying two guns where it's not really needed. So the media's doing their stupid, retarded thing with it. And the picture's kind of being used to push the Moms Demand Action anti-Kroger campaign. So basically, this guy's not helping things. We had a few more comments, but I really don't see anything where anybody said something about using it on the show. So in the future, any email I receive after this episode that refers to this episode or something after it, I'm going to go ahead and probably use it on the show. I'm just going to assume you're implying I have permission to use your email. If you don't want me to use your email, flat out say, hey, don't use this in the show, or paraphrase it or something like that, or don't even use my name. But just let me know, hey, you're not comfortable with me using you or your email in the show, and I won't do it. And with that said, we're going to kind of move on. I want to play the oh, good grief, I said it again. I want to play the social media contact or promo audio clip, and then we'll move on and we'll talk about reloading hardware. The Gun Rights in Texas podcast is available on social media. Links to all the social media profiles can be found on the website. On Twitter, the podcast is @GunRightsInTX. On Facebook and Google+, it is Gun Rights in Texas. So please, be social. Alrighty, we're here. We're going to talk about reloading, but we're not going to talk about actually reloading a cartridge. We may if we have time, but I have a sneaking suspicion this is going to be a long episode. I mean, we're already, 12 minutes or so into the show? I hate not having my clock on the wall, but oh well. So, reloading hardware. We're going to talk about the very basic hardware you need. And what I talk about by itself will not be enough to start reloading, but it's going to be enough to get the hardware you need to start reloading. So let's jump right in. And the first thing everybody needs, they don't think about it very often, but the first thing you need is reading material. Now, I know the gun grabbers think we're all a bunch of retarded redneck hicks that didn't get an education past kindergarten because our moms and our dads pulled us out of school to go work on the cotton farm. But guess what? They're wrong. Or at least I hope they are. No, I'm kidding. I know they're wrong because, well, it's just their stupid redneck stereotypes that they like to portray us with. But let's talk about the reading material. Now, in my opinion, I feel the book, The ABCs of Reloading, is critical for anybody to read if they've never reloaded a cartridge in their life. And even if they're an experienced reloader, if they haven't read it, it's still a good thing to read. There's a lot of information for everybody from the beginner to the expert. Even now, I go back and read it. I got an electronic copy. I got this off of, I believe it was Google, and I love it. It's a good book to read. That's all there is to it. And in the show notes, I'll throw in a link to it, but we'll come back to it in a moment. Now, I also recommend that all reloaders have at least 2 loading manuals, preferably more, but at least 2 so that they can verify the load data and avoid bad things that could happen if only one manual is used and that manual happens to have a misprint or some incorrect information. Personally, I have no clue how many loading manuals I have. I'll be honest, I just know that if I see a reloading manual I don't recognize, I tend to buy it. You can also find load data online, and this load data usually comes from the powder manufacturers. Sometimes it's from a bullet manufacturer. However, when you're using online reloading data, you have to make sure the source is reliable and trustworthy. I'm not going to use load data I find on xyzforums.com-.net-.org or whatever. I'm not going to use that. You have no idea how reliable that reloading data is. The person that released it has no liability for it. They may be saying, hey, throw 12 grains of X powder in with Y bullet and Z primer. Well, you do that and you press the trigger and the gun blows up. Meanwhile, while they're posting that, they're just snickering, yeah, I bet somebody will do this. It'd be funny to see the hospital photos. However, When I use reloading data from an online source such as, Ogden. Ogden has a lot of their load data online. And when I use it, I usually go and I got some different load manuals. I'll pull it up and I'll look at it. Even if it's not for the same bullet that I'm loading, I can still get a similar bullet and look, okay, this looks to be in the ballpark. So even if it's the only source of information for that combination, I can look up a similar combination in my load manual and, hey, that looks about right. Now I'm going to tell you a quick funny story about load data. This happened recently. My buddy Ray is the co-host with me on the Pro Gun podcast, which we still cannot get time together to do an episode of that. However, he calls me the other day. He's loading ammunition. He's wanting to verify the load data. So he tells me, hey, can you verify this? I told him, okay, let me look at the actual page in your book. Which book do you have? And he tells me it's the Hornady edition. We'll say the 8th edition. I don't remember which one it was. Or he tells me it's a Hornady book. So I grab my most current Hornady book and I look it up and he tells me which page it is. So I just flip open to that page and the load data on that page is nothing like what he's describing. Ray, what book are you using? What's the Hornady manual? Okay, can you look at the front and tell me what edition it is? He looks at the front. It's the edition before the one I have in hand. So, okay. I got that one too. I stand up, take one step, pull it off the bookshelf, sit right back down to where I'm at right now. Open it up to the correct page. Sure enough, there's the data. And then I grab another manual, open it up to the load data for that cartridge, and I compare it. The reason I say it's a funny story, I have different editions of the same manual with different load data. And I live off these. I actually have a manual that has no powders that are made today. I'll never use that data, but I have that load manual. Bought it at a gun show for $2, I believe. But it's one of the things I OCD on. I see a load manual that I don't have. If I can afford it, I buy it. And sometimes it can be a pain because I'm over here, I'm pulling up load manuals that don't match what people are expecting. But basically, the more load data you have available, the more opportunities you have to verify information that you get out of one against others. Now then, components. You gotta have components to reload. Some components can be substituted safely, some cannot. As a general rule, you should avoid substituting components with what is recommended in the load data until you know what you're doing. Now, some people say, well, it's okay to use X case or Y case. And normally that's the case, pun intended, but it may not be. Well, let me think of an example here. 223 and 5.56. You take a load in a 223 piece of brass, and it's perfectly safe in the 223 brass. You put that in the 5.56 brass, and now you have some dangerous overpressure conditions because the 5.56 brass is heavier. It's thicker. It has less volume. You take a case from, say, 1934, a 45 ACP case from 1934, and you take a 45 ACP case from 2013. You load them, you're probably going to see some pretty serious pressure differences between the two, even if they've only been fired once each. That's because these cases are different. They may be for the same cartridge, but they're still different. The volume's different, the overall length of the brass is different. Maybe the thickness of the base is different, but there are differences in this brass. You may have Hornady cases and you may have Remington cases. There's a good chance there's differences in those. So basically, you got to be careful when substituting components, even if it's something as often substituted as cases. When you make a change like that, start back at a minimum load and work your way up. Most loads or most powders, undercharges will not kill you. As long as you are careful and expect to deal with squibs, undercharges usually are not that bad. There are some loads that an undercharge is actually dangerous. There are powders that you do not go below the minimum safe load, not because you're afraid of a squib, but because they can do bad things. I'm not going to name the powder, but there's one powder I really like to use it, but I accidentally ran about 3/4 of the minimum load on it when I was initially working my load data up, and the gun it was fired in was not damaged, thankfully. But the fireball, because there was not enough pressure to move the bullet as quickly as it could go, and the powder burned so quick that it got out of the cylinder gap and it just floated back around. It didn't impart enough velocity to the bullet to clear it out where it could continue to go down the barrel. I mean, the bullet left the barrel, but the powder that was burning flashed out of it, came back around, and for about a month, I didn't have any hair on my hand or my wrist, and it could have been bad. It could have been very bad. But the powder used, from what I understand, I'm not an expert on this, but the way I understand it, this particular powder uses the pressure to regulate it. So the higher the pressure, the more regulation the powder has, and it doesn't do this. As the pressure dies down, it burns a little more, pressure comes back up, it's burning evenly. I don't know. All I know is if I hadn't had an undercharge on that load, I wouldn't have lost the hair on my hand. Fortunately, that's all I lost. But let's talk about what components are in a bullet, because I'm getting off topic. Well, there are 4 components in a loaded piece of ammunition. They are the case, the primer, the powder, and the bullet. And I've mentioned each of these, I believe, already, but just to actually go through and say these are the components, I had to do that. Now, when they are combined, they form a cartridge. It's kind of like Voltron. All the lines come together, they form the giant fighting robot. Except it's not a robot and it's not giant. And it doesn't fight. Well, maybe it does. It fights resistance. It fights the material that it hits, if it's targets or if it's threats. So maybe it does fight. But I'm getting off topic. I need to avoid recording these when I'm half asleep. Let me just say that. However, the thing about it is, you take these components, you put them together, and you do it correctly, you get usable working ammunition. You do it wrong, and you get bad things. Bad things ranging from squibs to guns exploding to losing the hair on your hand. One thing I do have to caution everybody on, and I'm kind of a bad person to do this myself. Experienced reloaders know that certain powders are the same as another powder. And I can't think of it right now, but Winchester 231 has an exact analog from another Ogden powder. And the load data for these is always identical. But even experienced reloaders know that it's dangerous to just simply grab that reloading data and use it. What if the formula changed since the powder was developed? Well, guess what? It does with and people don't really take this into account as much as they should. With every lot of powder, it behaves a little different. The formula is a little different. That's because of impurities in this particular material that's used here or there. And you get a little bit different behavior from the powder as a result. So avoid substituting one powder for another unless you have reloading data for both powders that shows, hey, they perform the same way in this cartridge. And even then, do so at your own risk with extreme caution. If you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. And that's the motto when you're reloading. If you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. But let's talk about the thing that everybody wants to talk about, reloading presses. Now, when it comes to reloading presses, there are 3 main classes of reloading press. One of my favorites for reloading, the single-stage press, such as my RCBS Rock Chucker 4. Now, the single-stage press, you typically use it in a manner where you do the same step to all the cartridges you're loading. You change the die, and you perform the next step, and then you repeat the process ad infinitum until you're done with the cartridge. Now, the second type of press is kind of related to the single-stage, but it's an improved version. It's the turret press. With a turret press, it depends on the type of press. There are auto-indexing turret presses, and then there's manually indexed turret presses. With a auto-indexing turret press, you pull the handle, it does one step. You pull the handle again, it does the next step. You pull the handle again, it does the next step. You pull the handle again, and it does the final step, or it does the next step until you're done. Well, that works out well. You can load one piece of ammunition before you do the next. If you have a manually indexed press, well, you can use it like the auto-indexing, but you turn it to the next station each time. Or you can use it like a single stage and do every step, index to the next station, do every piece of piece of ammunition, index again, repeat. It's up to you. I'm not that big of a fan of a turret press. I don't have one on my reloading bench. I have owned them, but I do not have one. And the third and final is my personal favorite for handgun ammunition, and that's the progressive press. I may end up upgrading my progressive press where I can do 223 ammo on it. I don't know. However, the progressive press loads multiple cartridges simultaneously. One is undergoing each stage of the process every time you pull the handle. And that's impressive. Now, the thing I like about the progressive press is when I'm reloading handgun ammunition, I just make it. The thing I like about the single stage press, when I'm loading Magnum handgun cartridges, or if I'm loading, say, ammunition to take prairie dog hunting, guess what? The single stage press is my choice. I can produce extremely accurate ammunition and extremely consistent ammunition. I could probably do that on a turret press. I could probably do that on a progressive press. But the fact that the single stage press is so slow, it forces me to slow down. It forces me to slow down to the point that I am paying attention to every detail. You get going with a progressive press, you're going to miss things. There's no two ways about it. Even the most experienced reloaders miss things when they're running a progressive because it's so complicated. Now, price-wise, the single stage is usually the cheapest, with the progressive being the most expensive. However, there are lines that kind of blur the distinction between those on pricing. You can probably pick up a Lee turret press for less than you can an RCBS Rock Chucker single stage press. Of course, these two presses are worlds apart in quality. However, before I move on, I was about to, and I need to mention this. There are other types of presses out there. There are hand presses. However, a hand press is just basically a single stage press that you do not mount to a bench. They're difficult to use. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the only hand press I have ever had the opportunity to use, you literally took a hammer and used the hammer to operate it. Yeah, that was not a very pretty thing, but that's what the instructions for it said. I don't even remember what brand that was. However, all the other presses out there will operate on the principles of either the single stage, the turret press, or the progressive press. Well, let's move on, and our next area we're going to talk about is dispensing a powder charge. Now, you have to be able to reliably measure your powder. And when I say reliably, you have to be able to do it consistently and make sure that it's going to be, when you measure it, you got to make sure that it's measured to what you want. So basically, you want it to throw a certain amount of powder and you verify it, and then you have to be able to trust the equipment to repeat that. Well, there are a number of ways to dispense and measure powder. Most people will use a scale to measure it, and there are two types of scales. The first scale is the old standby, the analog balance scale. I like the analog balance scales. In my opinion, they're far more accurate than the next type, which is the digital scale. Now, with an analog scale, you can literally see how far away you are from your charge weight. With a beam balance, you're going to more than likely be measuring to a tenth of a grain. With an analog, you know exactly when you hit that tenth of a grain. The next charge, if you're measuring every charge, that next charge is identical to the previous, and it'll be identical to the next. But be warned, not all beam balances are equal. My buddy Ray does not like the one that he has, or he may have a different one now. I don't know. I haven't seen his reloading gear in a little while. However, he didn't like the one he had when I last saw his reloading gear. That beam balance was a Lee Precision beam balance. It was not magnetically dampened. Excuse me. However, it was not magnetically dampened, so he can trickle a little bit of powder and it moves more than it should. It takes a little while for it to settle down. The one I use, an RCBS 505, I believe, it is magnetically dampened. And that one works very well. Well, when you're loading and you're using a digital scale, it's a lot faster than a beam balance. Because even if it's magnetically dampened, you still have to wait for it to calm down. With a digital scale, you throw your charge, you place the scoop on the scale, it tells you how much is there. The downside is it may say 4.3 grains and you actually have 4.39. Or you may have 4.34. Or maybe it rounds, instead of just truncating the last, the hundredths digit, maybe it rounds. So 4.25 is weighed as 4.3. Who knows? Different scales work differently. However, you can be up to 9/10 of a grain different between two charges and not know it. Now, if your scale measures out to the hundredths of a grain, you can be up to 9/100 of a grain different No, if it measures to the tenths, you can be up to 9/100ths of a grain different and not know it. If it measures to hundredths, you can be up to 9,000ths of a grain different and not know it. Like I said, I need a podcast when I'm not quite as tired. So basically, it depends on the programming of the scale and how it works as to how much of a charge you're going to actually be throwing and measuring as X amount when you're using a digital. And for me, using a digital scale is perfectly fine when you're measuring volumes for, say, a powder throw that's on a progressive press, or you're just throwing a powder charge and you're trickling. That works well. Or no, if you're trickling, but if you say you're throwing a charge, you're verifying it's close, you're dumping it and you're loading it, that's okay. But in my experience, when you're reloading, if you're loading for precision ammunition, use a beam balance. If you're just reloading for plinking ammunition, feel free to use the digital. Me, I use both. And it varies as to which one I use and when I use it. But as I was trying to do earlier, I was trying to move on to talking about measuring by volume. And when you measure by volume, you're saying, okay, this much volume of powder weighs X amount. And then you use that volume. Well, powder throws work on volume. Scoops work on volume. So basically, you got ways of measuring volume. When you see a progressive press, it's most likely measuring volume. And if you're like me and you really don't trust yourself to catch and make sure every powder charge looks to be correct, use a lockout die. Right now, on the Hornady press that's directly in front of the table I've got the podcasting equipment on that table where my reloading press, or the table in front of me, where my reloading press is mounted, where my progressive press is mounted, let me put it that way, sitting in it is an RCBS lockout die. If the charge is too much or too little, the press will not work. And this is a Hornady press. The lockout die is a great way to verify you're still throwing a relatively accurate powder charge. But you still have to be careful that the die doesn't stick, because they do occasionally do that. Now, when you're using a powder throw technique, the powder density, the powder consistency, how much powder is still in the powder throw's reservoir, these and other factors influence the accuracy of the powder throw system. I have a friend that he likes to use a massive reservoir on his press, or on his powder throw that he's got mounted on his progressive press. I really don't feel comfortable mentioning who he is because he might take offense at it, but he likes to have this massive reservoir, and he'll probably load nearly everything that's in that massive reservoir. However, when you're shooting with him, you can tell when he's getting to the ammunition he loaded last, because that ammunition that he loads last is almost always going to be quieter. It's going to be weaker. It's going to have less recoil because the volume isn't generating enough pressure from the weight of the powder to fully charge the cylinder's throw. And I hate to say it, but one of these days it's going to turn out it's going to bite him. Now, there is another way to measure powder by volume other than a powder throw, and that's the scoop system. And a lot of people, if they buy a set of Lee Precision dies, they'll find the stupid little yellow scoop that comes in it. Sometimes it's a different color, but it's usually yellow. And these stupid yellow scoops are pretty much useless to the reloader because, well, who's going to say that scoop is the right amount for their powder? I usually take those and throw them away. However, if you have a complete set of those scoops, you actually have the ability to measure powder by volume, and you can load accurately. In fact, it'll probably be more accurate than using a powder throw. You know what? We're getting kind of long into the podcast, so we're going to kind of hurry up and move through this. And to do that, we need to talk about the next component. I've already discussed it a little bit, and that was dies. I talked about the powder check die, but there's other dies. And the first thing you need to consider when you're buying dies are, do you buy carbide dies or not? Carbide dies are ideal for loading straight wall cases, and that's about it. They're more expensive than non-carbide dies. I got a buddy that he swears to God that carbide dies mangle cases, and he will not use a carbide die for anything. All of his dies, especially his pistol dies, are older dies because he doesn't want to risk them putting a carbide ring in anything. Now, I'll admit this friend, he's an older gentleman, and the carbide dies are not something that was around when he started reloading, or at least they weren't popular then. And I have never seen carbide dies do anything bad to brass. In fact, they avoid stuck cases, so I like them. And that's why you'd use a carbide die. You don't have to lube the case, and you don't have to worry about it getting stuck. Now, with non-carbide dies, you have to lube every case, or you will most likely get the case stuck in the sizing die. And when you get a case stuck, you have to have a removal tool, or in some extreme cases, you have to send the die in to have it removed by the manufacturer, or you have to replace the die. So carbide dies are good. If you're using a non-carbide die, lube your cases. Now, when you're loading cartridges, say 223, 5.56, or, well, take a 308 or 270 or 30-06. Those are all neck cases. Well, carbide dies don't work on those. Now that we got carbide and non-carbide dies lined out, let's talk about the different variations in dies. You have a sizing die. Sizing dies also typically deprime the case. You can get a dedicated die to deprime. These are often called decapping dies. The pins that in a sizing or decapping die are called decapping pins. They go all the way through the length of the case. They press the primer out. It falls out a tube in the press, or it falls out of a hole in the press, and it goes either into a tube or a catch. And if it goes into the tube, you can route the tube to go into a trash can, kind of like my Hornady press. Now, when you're using a sizing die, there's actually two types of sizing dies, at least when you're using neck cases. You have a full-length sizing die, and then you have a neck sizing die. A full-length sizing die works well when you're loading semi-auto ammunition. In fact, you want a full-length sizing die unless you're sizing for a very specific application, and I'll get into that in a moment when we talk about neck sizing. But a full-length sizing die works for handgun cartridges. It works for rifle cartridges, and overall, it's a good die to have. But the neck sizing die, it's limited in its application. About the only time you use a neck sizing die is when you're loading for a bolt action and the brass was used in that very same gun. You do not use it for a semi-auto. You do not use it for a bolt action when the brass was fired in a semi-auto or another bolt action or a lever action. The brass has to be used in the same gun prior to sizing in a neck sizing die. And the reason you use a neck sizing die is you can get more accuracy out of it. It can extend the length of the brass's life, and it doesn't require as much work to resize the brass, and you run the risk of a stuck case, or the risk you run of a stuck case is much lower. Well, the next type of die you can encounter is a charging die. Charging die is where you, like on a progressive or a turret press, you charge the case with powder. And it depends on the type of presses how the charging die works, but you get the idea. The next die is, if you're running like I am, the powder check die. You might have a bullet feed die, and then you'll have a seating die. Seating dies are required because they seat the bullet at the correct depth. Now, seating dies are often combined with the next type of die so that instead of two, you only have one. And the next type of die is a crimp die. A lot of people do not need to use a crimping die, but some people do. And there's actually two types of crimping dies, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Basically, the only time you need to use a crimping die is if you cycle around through the gun and then you measure it and you find there's noticeable setback. And by noticeable, I mean with a caliper. If the cartridge is shorter coming out of the chamber when you cycle it and you cycle the round into the chamber and then you extract the complete round. If the complete round is shorter after that than before, you may want to crimp it. For semi-auto handgun cartridges, I crimp them. For most rifle cartridges, I don't. And when I'm shooting Magnum handgun cartridges, I crimp them. But the crimps are different for the different types of cartridge. You have roll crimps, which take the mouth of the case and kind of roll it into the bullet. This provides a very snug hold on the bullet. And then you have a taper die or a taper crimp, where it just tapers the brass just a little bit to hold the bullet in place. Well, the difference in the two is chamber pressure, or the result of the difference of the two is the difference in chamber pressure and if it'll pull the bullet apart under recoil. See, a roll crimp is designed to hold the bullet from forward and backward stress, or compression and it's designed to hold it from the bullet being pushed back or pulled out. Let's put it that way. While a taper crimp is designed to keep the bullet from being pushed in too much further. Taper crimps are used on semi-auto handguns, semi-auto rifles, anything that the mouth of the case is what the cartridge headspace is on. If the cartridge headspace is on the rim or the shoulders of the case, you can use either type of die. Although you may prefer a roll crimp on a 44 mag that's shooting full power loads, where on a 45 auto, a taper crimp is required. So you get different types of sizing based on the nature of the cartridge and what your intended application is. I could go into more details, but I'm starting to wander off and this episode's getting long. I know it's kind of boring to a lot of people, so let's move on. I've covered most of the dies that we need to cover, and I really don't think we need to cover it any further. But real quick, we're going to cover a few tools that every reloader needs, and then we're going to cover some record keeping, and we'll wrap the show up with the news. Now, the other tools that you are required to use when you're reloading, or you may be required to use when reloading, are calipers. Use these to measure the case length, the case trimmer, so you can trim the or I say measure the case length, you're also measuring your cartridge length with them too. You need a case trimmer to correct the length of the case so that it's within spec. Very important when you're loading semi-auto cartridges that headspace on the mouth. And it's very important when you're loading revolver cartridges that headspace on, or even rifle cartridges, and they headspace on the shoulders or the rim of the cartridge. The reason it's important is if the cartridge is too long, you may end up with it not going fully into battery, or you may end up with some of your brass getting stuck in the rifling. Ooh, sorry about that. I just bumped the microphone. I was picking up a piece of reloading equipment, and I was reaching past the microphone onto the desk, and I bumped the microphone when I was reaching. The next tool you need is a chamfer tool. Blah, I'm getting tongue-tied. A chamfer tool. And the reason you need a chamfer tool is you chamfer the case when you trim it. This removes burrs from the outside and the inside of the mouth of the case. You'll also need a way of priming the case. Now, a lot of folks will prime on the press. Some folks will prime using a hand primer, and there's other tools that you can use to prime with. There's one that's that's mounted on the bench. It's kind of like a little miniature press of its own that's dedicated to priming. But there's a lot of different tools, and you can get whichever ones you need and make them work. Now, we have already discussed powder throws and scoops, but if you want to reload precision ammunition, a powder trickler is the ticket for that. Now, there are a lot more tools that you might want or you might need based on your application, but we just don't have time to cover them, so we're going to move on. And that pretty much covers everything you need to actually load ammunition on the hardware side. I may have missed one or two little things, like a a primer flipping tray. That's always nice to have, but you can get around it. There are ways to get around these little issues, and you'll see about those as you start reloading, especially if you get the book ABCs of Reloading. You'll see in that there are options. But let's talk about something that every reloader needs, and you can get it cheap. You can go and you can pick it up at the grocery store. You can go and you can pick it up at Walmart. You can go get one that's designed for the purpose and get it at wherever you get your reloading supplies. But you need some kind of a logbook. You can use a spiral-bound notebook. You can use a 3-ring binder, kind of like I do. Or you can use a spreadsheet, kind of like I do. And personally, what I do, my 3-ring binder has computer printouts. Every time I have loaded ammunition, it is logged. The 3-ring binder has both printouts and handwritten information. When I have enough information in my printouts to do a new page, I will replace most, if not all, of the handwritten data with another computer printout that's easier to read than my handwriting. If something happens to my computer data, I got my 3-ring binder. If something happens to my 3-ring binder, I've got my computer printout. Basically, I keep 2, and I clean up the binder with computer printouts because they're easier to, let me put it that way. Now, there are computer programs that are designed specifically to log load data. However, in my case, I just use a spreadsheet simply because I have one pre-installed on my computer, and I really don't use it for much more than balancing my checkbook. And you know what? I think it's time to wrap up the topic. We're going to say that's it. So that's the hardware we're going to discuss on this episode, and we're going to move on into the news. But before I do that, let me play an audio clip that, It tells you how to get in touch with me here at the show, and you can send me your emails with your comments, suggestions, recommendations, and hey, that was a bad idea. Don't ever talk about reloading again because you put me to sleep. But I appreciate the cure for insomnia, so I'm keeping that episode around. Whatever you want to do, let me know. Whatever you think, let me know. And how? Well, listen to this. If you want to contact the podcast, please send email to Aaron at gunrightsintexas.com. Or you can leave a comment on the webpage, which is gunrightsintexas.com. However, if you want to leave a voicemail and be featured on the show, then please do so by dialing 409-292-6736. Alrighty then, it's time for the news. Okay, fake radio voice is over. We have quite a bit of news. I'm going to kind of pare it down a little, not too much. Well, I won't pare it down a lot because I don't think you need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's a metric ton of stories here. We're not going to cover all of them. We're going to cover the highlights. We're going to cover 2 stories that are in self-defense or in defense of others. The first one, a 71-year-old man defended himself and his wife when he shot a suspect trying to rob his wife outside a grocery store on October 28th. Now, the man was injured, his wife was shaken up, and the suspect died in his getaway vehicle. The article does have some incorrect observations about Texas law, but it does mention that the gentleman that defended himself and his wife had a concealed carry license, and his case will be heard by a grand jury, which is standard practice. Although they don't mention it is standard practice, but it is. Now, we do have a second self-defense story. In Dallas, Texas, a 22-year-old man was shot after he attacked another man with a tire iron and hit him twice. Now, the suspect appeared to be intoxicated and was damaging property when his victim, who has a concealed handgun license, tried to stop him from damaging the victim's vehicle. Now, after being hit twice with a tire iron, the victim was able to draw his weapon and shoot the attacker, fatally wounding him. Now, as in the case before, the victim's case will be heard by a grand jury, although the victim was not arrested or charged in connection with this event. A lot of people will be thinking, well, why is it going to the grand jury? But when you get a no bill from a grand jury, it makes it a lot easier to shore up a defense against a civil lawsuit, or at least it does in Texas. See, in Texas, we have a law that if you use deadly force or you use force in defense of yourself or others, you cannot be sued in civil court. Well, you have to be, in order for that defense to work, you have to prove that the self-defense was justified. If it goes to a grand jury, they no bill it. That pretty much says, yeah, this was justified. And that's really why you really want your case to go to a grand jury in Texas. Well, that's my understanding. I'm not an attorney, but I have had an attorney tell me this. And I'm not going to mention that attorney's name. He's never been on the podcast. And I don't want to kind of say he's endorsing this or anything like that. Before you take that advice, talk to an attorney yourself, because there was a lot more before and after what I told you. And what I told you doesn't quite cover it. There's a lot more involved, but that's the Reader's Digest pared down and snippet version. But you know what? Let's move on to the crime report section. We got one story there where this story basically is why you don't leave stuff in your vehicle when you have people doing stuff to it. In Temple, Texas, a car wash employee was accused of stealing a handgun from a customer's car. Upon finding the suspect, police located the stolen handgun, a quantity of marijuana, as well as an additional handgun. The article doesn't mention if the additional handgun was stolen or not. However, the suspect was arrested and booked into Bell County Jail. We have 2 stories in politics that we'll cover, and then we'll hit 1 or 2 more in the miscellaneous department and wrap it up. We'll do 4 more stories. 2 in politics and 2 in miscellany. Okay? The Carrollton Police Department is one of the departments that will be testing a new system from a startup called YardArm. Now, this system fits in the base of a Glock handgun. Unfortunately, that may not be the best place to put it because that's designed to allow debris and moisture and all that to get out of the gun, but who cares? People like to stick things in it anyway, like plugs. Now, this system actually tracks a number of data points when a weapon is fired. That data includes the location, the direction it was aimed, as well as when the firearm was unholstered. So basically, if the officer says, well, I unholstered, I ordered him to the ground twice, and he didn't comply, and then he lunged at me and I shot him, and they pull the data up, the weapon was unholstered, 15 seconds later it was discharged, yeah, that supports the officer's statement. Or maybe they pull the data up, it shows the weapon was unholstered, and half a second later it was discharged. Well, that doesn't support the officer's statement. So, this could be good for the police. It could be bad for the police, because a human memory doesn't quite remember things the way they happen. So let's say the officer drew his weapon and half a second later discharged it. It doesn't jive with his story, but that's how he remembers the story, because he remembers he drew his gun before ordering the suspect to comply twice. But what if he ordered the suspect to comply twice, the suspect lunged at him, and he drew his weapon and fired? He may not remember it that way, even though that's the way it happened. Why? Because human memory is flawed. But let's get back to Yardarm. Yardarm was founded after the Sandy Hook tragedy to develop a consumer firearm that could be remotely disabled. That project was wisely abandoned after protests from gun rights advocates. Now, the next story we have is where, and this is more of a court case than it is political, but it's going to get political. Now, in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas, Dallas Division, we have a case where a gentleman is challenged. Let's see here. Okay. The Northern United States District Court for the Northern District of Dallas, or the Northern District of Texas, the Dallas Division, is the court where a case challenging the federal ban on machine guns has been filed. I was reading that story, and I was reading another one we have in politics, and the word Dallas is in both of them, and I kind of shifted. They're both about the same story, but this is the better one. Now, this case is based on violations of Article 1 of the Constitution, as well as violations of the 2nd, 9th, and 10th Amendments of the Constitution. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically the idea is that the government's violating the Constitution because you're not getting due process when they're saying, nope, no brand new machine gun for you. And it's violating the 2nd Amendment because of the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And it's in violation of the 9th and 10th Amendments as well. Well, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in court, because the Heller decision said unusual and dangerous weapons were able to be banned, or at least highly regulated. So there may be a little bit of an issue in that regard. So this case could easily make it to the Supreme Court, I think. It'd be interesting to see what happens on it. Let's put it that way. So let's move on to the miscellaneous stories, and we'll skip the other story I was starting to read when I was in the middle of reading that one, and we'll skip the one right after that. So in the miscellaneous story division, we have a Houston man that was shot in the face by his own firearm after it fell from his pocket while he was sleeping. He awoke, and as the 3-year-old picked up the weapon, he lunged for the weapon, and the article is unclear if the child fired the weapon or if the man did when he was lunging for it. However, the shooting was classified as accidental and is still being investigated. The 3-year-old, fortunately, was not injured. Now, the Gun Rights in Texas podcast wants to say, and by the Gun Rights in Texas podcast, I'm saying me, because I am the Gun Rights in Texas podcast, basically. Please maintain proper control of your weapon. And if you're going to carry a gun, carry it in a good holster. If you're going to be in a position where the weapon may fall out, maybe your holster is not proper. Just saying. All right, we have one more story I'm going to touch on. I'm skipping 2 others. Now, we have a story where more West Texas women are legally carrying guns for self-defense. The article is a pretty positive article that features a brief interview with the owner of a female-friendly gun store called Heart of Texas Firearms. Now, that particular gun store is located in Abilene, Texas. And you know what? I looked them up on the internet, and they seem to kind of cater towards women, which is a great thing. All I can say is, if you're in that area and you're a female listener and you want to take a CHL class or one of their other defensive classes geared towards women, they look like a good outfit to go to. This isn't an endorsement. This isn't any kind of an advertisement for them. It's just, I saw their name in the news and it looked interesting. Now, I would like to thank some people before we wrap up the show. And like usual, I like to say I want to thank the NRA and the TSRA for their efforts. I also want to do something a little different. I want to thank each and every listener and each and every non-listener that went out and voted. I don't care if you voted for people that are gun-friendly or anti-gun. You went out there and you made the process work. I want to offer another round of thanks to the people that actually went out there and they voted to keep their rights intact. If you voted for a pro-gun candidate, more power to you and more thanks to you. I always want to encourage everybody to go out and vote. If we can have 150 people out of 160 go out and vote, and the only people that are not voting are 10 felons, that's great. If we can get 160 out of 160 people to vote, and none of them are in any way disbarred from voting, even better. But you know what? I want to talk a little bit before we sign off about something I saw when I was doing my early voting. And this episode's going to be released before the elections on Tuesday, but a lot of people will listen to it afterwards. So if you have early voted or you're going to vote, you also have my thanks. I went and I early voted. And on the Libertarian ticket for one of the court races, there's a gentleman running under the name Quanah Parker. Well, Quanah Parker is an interesting name, especially for those of us here in West Texas, such as myself in Gaines County. In Gaines County, it's got even more of a meaning because, well, the last great chief of the Comanche Nation was a gentleman by the name of Quanah Parker. And at one point, he was in Lubbock, and he was getting ready to go to what he said he understood was his place of birth. And that location is here in Gaines County. There's a couple of different stories about where he was born, a couple of different theories. But at the time he was asked where he was going, he said he was coming to a location that's currently in Gaines County because he understood it was where he was born. That location was called Laguna Sabinas, or as it's known in modern times, Cedar Lake. Now, his actual site of birth was believed to be near that location. There are other locations that are believed to be the site of his birth as well. However, the Quanah Parker that's on the Libertarian ticket is not the Quanah Parker that was born possibly in Gaines County. That Quanah Parker does not look like the other Quanah Parker. However, I found the name amusing, and I almost voted for him just out of the fact that, well, he had a cool name. But then the rational part of my brain said, well, you've actually discussed things with people that know about this candidate that you plan to vote for. You actually are informed on this other candidate. So why not just go ahead and vote like you planned and avoid doing something stupid? And I did. Here's the thing. I had never heard of Quanah Parker, the political candidate for the Libertarian Party. And just because they're running on a particular party's ticket does not mean that they endorse the beliefs of that party. I mean, we see that with a lot of Democrats and Republicans, especially the ones on the national level. So without knowing more about Quanah Parker, the Libertarian candidate, I couldn't bring myself to vote for him, even though I found his name was significant to that. And the more I thought about it, the more it made me mad. He may have changed his name just to have the political power that comes with, hey, I'll vote for him because he's got a cool name. So basically, go out there. If you haven't voted already, go vote and you'll have earned my thanks. I know it's not much, but thank you if you vote. Thank you if you have voted. And thank you if you have voted for pro-gun candidates. With that said, we're going to sign the show off, and then we'll go on to our New to Guns in Texas segment, which, if you don't want to hear something about being new to guns in Texas, when the music hits, just turn the podcast off and ignore the rest. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Gun Rights in Texas podcast. Please leave a review on iTunes or send feedback to the host. Your input will be used to improve the show. Stay safe and please carry responsibly. Okay, I was a little underprepared for this episode because I didn't quite work out what I had originally planned to talk about on the New to Guns in Texas segment. However, we are still going to talk about New to Guns in Texas, but we're going to talk about something that a lot of people are overlooking. You see a lot of people, they bring a new gun home and they put it on the top shelf of their closet, or if it's a rifle, they stick it in the back corner of their closet behind a whole bunch of clothes. And unfortunately, while that may be good, for them, it's irresponsible, especially if they have children in their home. Basically, you want to keep your weapons and your firearms and even your valuables secure. And to do that, you need some kind of structure to keep people that are not authorized to have them from having easy access. A good safe is just going to slow somebody down and keep them from breaking in as quickly as they could have, as if it had been just a sheet metal gun cabinet. A sheet metal gun cabinet will slow people down and keep them from getting the weapons as fast as it would have if you had your gun stored in your closet. Having your gun stored in your closet keeps people from stealing them as fast as they would if they were left outside on the porch unattended. And basically, that's what we're talking about here. We're going to talk about storing your firearms. If you have a limited amount of room, maybe you want to keep your firearms in their cases. Not recommended, because most of those cases have foam rubber. Foam rubber actually attracts moisture and will cause the firearms to rust. Even stainless steel will rust eventually. So maybe you invest in a cheap gun cabinet. A cheap gun cabinet may slow somebody down slightly, but it may keep children from gaining access, and that's always good. Maybe you got a little bit more money, maybe you got a little bit more room, so you turn and you get a safe. But you don't have very much money, so you buy a cheap safe like a Stack-On. Keep in mind, the Stack-On safes usually don't have fire ratings. But let's say you got a little bit more money than that, and you can buy a firearm safe that has just a little bit more money. Well, maybe that little bit more money buys you a fire rating. Maybe it buys you a little bit heavier construction of steel that slows people down from stealing the firearms quite as quick. Or maybe you just simply buy a handgun safe because that's all you got, and you bolt it down to a shelf in your closet that nobody can pull out. However, you need to buy something to keep your firearms safe and to keep it from being accessed by somebody that should not have access to it. That's all there is to it. With that said, I'm your host, Aaron Heath, and, well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sign this episode off. So please, stay safe and carry responsibly.